The darkness inside the house felt thick, almost suffocating, as Sarah moved in absolute silence through the hallways. The old wooden floors creaked beneath her feet, and with every small noise, she froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew they needed to go out that night. His father, Icarus, had been out of control for years, but in recent months, something terrible seemed to have taken hold of him. The blank stare, the irrational screams, and the hands that were once only threatening were now heavy with violence. There was no more room for hesitation. It was time to escape. Next to Sarah, Daniel, her 9-year-old younger brother, watched her with his big, trusting eyes. He knew his sister would always care for him, always protect him, even when the world around them was falling apart. Daniel had Down syndrome, and although he was an extremely loving and kind child, Icarus' outbursts left him deeply frightened. Every time his father started screaming, Daniel cowered in a corner, waiting for the nightmare to end. But Sarah knew this nightmare wouldn't end unless they escaped. It was a moonless night, the sky covered in thick clouds. Sarah waited patiently for the right moment. Icarus had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, a glass of drink spilled on the floor beside him. She shook hands with Daniel, who stood ready at her side, a small backpack slung over his shoulders. She had gathered what she could, some clothes, money she had managed to hide over time, and, most importantly, hope for a better future. There was nothing more to hope for. With a suppressed sigh, she opened the front door as carefully as possible, the rattle of the old hinge sounding like a scream in the stillness of the night. Outside, the air was cold and damp. The wind blew against their faces, but it was nothing compared to the constant cold they felt inside that house. Sarah pulled Daniel by the hand, and together they began to walk down the dark street, their feet tapping against the damp asphalt. They didn't know exactly where they were going, but Sarah had a simple plan: get as far away from Icarus as possible. She had heard about a shelter in a nearby town, a place where children like them could find safety. The walk seemed endless. Daniel, tired, tried to keep up with his sister, his short and clumsy steps causing Sarah to slow down. Even without fully understanding what was happening, he kept his gaze fixed on her, trusting each step they took. "It's going to be okay," Sarah repeated to herself, even though she wasn't sure about it. The fear of the unknown was great, but the terror they left behind was much greater. After hours of walking through the silent streets, they finally arrived at the nearest bus station. Sarah approached the ticket booth, carefully counting the money she had saved. He managed to buy 2 tickets to a distant city, a place where he hoped no one would find them, especially Icarus. As they waited for the bus to arrive, Sarah looked at her brother sleeping on her lap, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her heart. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to offer Daniel a better life, away from all that pain. The sound of the bus engine breaking the early morning silence was like a promise of hope. They boarded, and as the vehicle moved down the road, Sarah allowed herself, for a brief moment, to believe that they were safe. But in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that the past would not be left behind so easily. She didn't know what the future held, but she was sure that Icarus hadn't given up on them yet. The bus took them for hours, crossing narrow roads and unfamiliar towns. Sarah couldn't rest. Her body was on constant alert, as if Icarus could appear at any moment. She looked out the window, trying to commit the landscapes to memory, hoping that the further they went, the safer they would be. Beside her, Daniel slept with his head resting on his sister's shoulder, his innocent sleep contrasting with the tension Sarah carried. When they finally got off the bus, the sun was already rising. The small town was peaceful, unlike anything they knew. The streets were quiet, with few people in sight, and the distant sound of birds gave an almost surreal feeling of peace. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to absorb that calm. She took a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket, where she had written down the address of the shelter. This was where they would start again. They continued on foot through the streets until they found the shelter, a simple but welcoming building. The name Casa Nova Esperanza was painted in large letters on the front. Sarah hesitated for a moment. She knew that entering that place meant admitting the reality of everything they had been through. But as she looked at Daniel, who was holding her hand tightly, she felt there was no choice. They needed help, and this was the only place that could offer it. They were welcomed by a kind woman named Donna Alice, who had worked at the shelter for years. With gray hair tied into a bun and a welcoming smile, she immediately noticed the exhaustion in Sarah's eyes. Without asking many questions, she led them inside, offering shelter and a hot meal. Sitting at the table, Sarah and Daniel ate in silence, both relieved to finally be away from the chaos they called home. Mrs. Alice watched carefully, feeling that these children had been through much more than they were willing to tell at that moment. After the meal, Donna Alice took them to a simple but comfortable room. The beds were small, but for Sarah and Daniel, that was enough. They finally had a safe roof over their heads. Sarah helped Daniel lie down, and as he quickly fell asleep, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The last few months had been a storm, and she knew the future was still uncertain. But there, in that moment, she allowed a small spark of hope to emerge. Maybe, finally, they could rebuild their lives. In the days that followed, Sarah began to adapt to the shelter's routine. The other children there had similar stories, and although each one carried their own scars, there was an atmosphere of solidarity between them. Donna Alice took care of everyone like a true mother, creating an environment of safety that Sarah had never experienced. Daniel, in turn, flourished in that new environment. He loved the attention from the other children and especially the artistic activities the shelter offered. Painting and drawing became her forms of expression, and little by little Sarah saw the shine return to her brother's eyes. However, as time passed, the thought of Icarus did not leave Sarah alone. She knew that her father was not the type of person who would give up easily. Even though he was physically distant, Sarah felt as if his shadow still followed them. She lived in fear that, at any moment, he might appear to take them back to that life of terror. But every time fear threatened to overwhelm her, she looked to Daniel, reminding herself that now, more than ever, she had a reason to keep fighting. 6 months had passed since Sarah and Daniel arrived at Casa Nova Esperança. The routine had become a constant, a kind of calm they had never experienced before. Sarah now helped Donna Alice with the other children at the shelter, a way of reciprocating the welcome they had received. She was still a teenager, but she felt like she had matured a lot in the last few months. Being responsible for Daniel had transformed her, and now, she found strength in small, everyday victories. Seeing her brother smiling, waking up without the dread of past nights. Daniel also seemed to flourish in that environment. He had made friends among the other children and was learning to express himself in new ways. Art had become his passion, and Donna Alice encouraged him at every step. The walls of the shelter now displayed colorful drawings that Daniel had made, full of shapes and colors that expressed his vision of the world. For Sarah, seeing Daniel like this, so full of life, was a relief she could barely describe. However, despite all this newfound peace, something bothered Sarah. Icarus. She knew her father wouldn't give up so easily on finding them. He was a cruel man, but he was also meticulous and obstinate. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, Sarah would wake up with a start, believing she heard the sound of footsteps or the hoarse voice of Icarus calling for her and Daniel. Those nights were the hardest, when the past seemed to come dangerously close to the present. One afternoon, while helping Donna Alice tidy the shelter's pantry, Sarah heard a conversation that made her heart freeze. 2 of the employees were talking about a man who had asked about missing children in the neighboring town. They mentioned that the man seemed troubled, with a blank stare and a frightening insistence. He looked desperate, one of them commented, and that was enough to make Sarah feel a chill run up her spine. She knew that that man could only be Icarus. In the days that followed, Sarah began to become even more attentive. Every unusual movement left her in a state of alert. She avoided going out alone and kept an eye on Daniel, who, in turn, seemed oblivious to these fears. Her innocence and confidence protected her, but Sarah knew the danger was real. She wondered how long they had until Icarus found them. The peace they had built seemed fragile, like a bubble about to burst. Donna Alice noticed the change in Sarah. One night, while the children were already sleeping, she called Sarah for a talk. "I know you're worried, my dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know what happened to you before you got here, but I know that fear still haunts you. You need to trust that you are safe now. We are here for you." Sarah wanted to believe. She really wanted to. But the survival instinct within her was stronger, and she knew that eventually they would have to face the man who still hunted them. The news came like a storm. A man had been seen on the outskirts of the shelter, insistently asking for Sarah and Daniel. The descriptions matched Icarus exactly. At first, Donna Alice tried to calm Sarah, saying that maybe it was just a coincidence. But the look of panic in the young woman's eyes made it clear that it wasn't just paranoia. Icarus was closer than ever, and time seemed to be running out. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Sitting on the bed, she looked at Daniel, who was sleeping soundly, his expression peaceful. He had no idea of the danger they were about to face again. Sarah, however, felt as if the weight of all that trauma had returned with full force. What would they do now? Run again? Where could they hide? The shelter had been the only place where she had felt safe, but now even there she felt threatened. The next day, Sarah decided to tell Donna Alice everything. She knew that hiding the details was no longer an option. In the small office room, with the door closed, Sarah finally revealed the hell they had experienced at the hands of Icarus. Donna Alice listened in silence, her face serious and full of compassion. When Sarah finished speaking, she felt relieved, as if an immense burden had been lifted from her shoulders. But the relief was momentary, as reality soon set in. Icarus would find them sooner or later. Donna Alice acted quickly. She contacted local authorities and prepared the shelter for any eventuality. Sarah and Daniel were instructed not to leave the place without supervision, and everyone in the shelter was on alert. The environment, which had previously been welcoming, now seemed tense, with everyone fearing Icarus' arrival. The tranquility was gone, replaced by constant anxiety. Sarah tried to remain calm, but fear consumed her. Every unusual sound made her jump, and the thought that Icarus might appear at any moment was unbearable. She blamed herself for not running away sooner, for not disappearing for good. Now, they were at that man's mercy, and Sarah didn't know if she would have the strength to face him again. The week passed in an atmosphere of increasing tension. Each day seemed to drag by with oppressive slowness, and Sarah felt like time was running against them. The children at the shelter noticed the different atmosphere, and even Daniel, normally so oblivious to the stress around him, began to ask why his sister was so worried. Sarah tried to hide it, smiling at him and saying everything would be fine, but inside she could barely breathe. Every movement outside the shelter, every unknown visitor, every car that stopped on the street seemed to be a threat. Donna Alice did her best to reinforce the shelter's security, but she was also limited in her actions. The shelter was not a detention center, and the doors could not be locked like a prison. Icarus' proximity was suffocating, even though he hadn't yet made direct contact. Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before he showed up. The fear was almost tangible, a constant presence around him. She spent the nights awake, imagining the worst possible scenarios. Icarus forcing his way into the shelter, or worse, luring Daniel out with false promises. His brother, with his pure heart and natural trust in people, would not understand the danger until it was too late. Meanwhile, life inside the shelter continued its course. The other children continued with their daily activities, but there was a new caution in everyone's movements. The once carefree caregivers now looked out the windows frequently, and whenever someone knocked on the door, Sarah's heart raced. She knew she was living in a temporary protective bubble, and that bubble was about to burst. The mere thought of having to face Icarus again left her paralyzed with fear. And once again, she asked herself, should they run away again? But where? Were there places in the world where they could be truly safe? Then, on a cold, cloudy morning, the inevitable happened. An old, noisy car stopped in front of the shelter. The sound of the engine shutting down echoed in Sarah's head like the sign of a fate she could not avoid. From her window, she saw a man get out of the car, his gait too clumsy and heavy to ignore. It was him, Icarus, your father, the man who had destroyed her childhood and who was now here, so close that Sarah could barely breathe. He looked around with half-closed eyes, like a predator assessing the territory before attacking. Sarah felt absolute panic. She ran to Miss Alice's office, the words barely leaving her mouth as she tried to warn her. "He's here," she whispered, her voice shaking and her eyes wide with pure terror. Donna Alice didn't hesitate. Immediately, he asked that the doors be locked and the windows closed. The other caregivers began to guide the children inside, and Daniel, without understanding, looked around in confusion. "What's going on, Sarah?" he asked, holding his sister's hand tightly. Sarah didn't know how to explain it. She just hugged him, as if that could protect him from everything that was about to happen. Icarus approached the front door, his gait now slower, as if he was mentally preparing himself for the confrontation. He knocked, and the sound made Sarah's heart leap in her chest. She knew this moment would come, but now that she was in front of him, she didn't know how to react. The caregivers gathered near the entrance, and Donna Alice was the one who took the lead. With surprising calm, she opened the door a crack and faced the man on the other side. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Icarus, his face marked by time and excess, looked at her with contempt. "I'm here for my children," he replied. The tension at the shelter door was almost unbearable. Donna Alice, a woman used to dealing with difficult situations, remained calm, but even she sensed danger in the air. Icarus was an unstable man, and his words, although delivered in a controlled manner, carried an underlying threat. "My children are here and I'm going to take them," he said, crossing his arms and planting his feet firmly on the ground, as if defying any attempt to stop him. Icarus's gaze was cold and calculating, but there was something deeper there, a kind of obsession that Sarah recognized immediately. He wouldn't give up easily. Donna Alice didn't back down. "No one's children leave this shelter without our permission," she replied, her voice never losing its firmness. Icarus laughed, a bitter, hoarse laugh. "You think you can stop me? They're mine. I know what's best for them." Inside, Sarah felt like her soul was being ripped apart. The man outside had no right to claim them, not after everything he had put them through. But he was there at the door trying to take back the control he had lost. From behind the door, Sarah peeked out, her entire body shaking with fear. She pulled Daniel closer, fearing that he would make some move that would catch Icarus's attention. His brother seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation, but the tension in the air didn't go unnoticed by him. "Who's out there, Sarah?" he asked, his voice soft but full of curiosity. She didn't respond. The panic inside her grew with every second that Icarus remained there, insisting on taking them back to hell. Icaro took a step towards the door, but Donna Alice didn't back down. "This is a safe haven," she said. "The children here are under our protection. If you have a complaint, you can take it to the Child Protection Council, but we won't allow you to take them." Icarus's face hardened. He looked ready to explode, but something held him back. Maybe it was the presence of other people in the shelter. Maybe he knew he couldn't use force without attracting the attention of the police. Even so, he cast a threatening look into the house. "It won't stay like this," he said, his voice low but full of venom. "I'm going back, and when I come back, you won't stop me." With those words, Icarus turned and walked back to the car. Sarah felt temporary relief, but she knew that this was not the end. Their father would return, and the next time, he might be even more determined to take them. She could barely think, fear still gripping her as she watched the car disappear down the road. Inside the shelter, the atmosphere remained tense. The caregivers exchanged worried looks, and Ms. Alice went to Sarah, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We're here for you," she said. But Sarah felt as if those words were insufficient to protect them from what was to come. "I knew that Icarus would not give up, and I feared that, next time, he would come with more force, perhaps with the support of authorities who did not know the truth about who he really was." That night was difficult. Sarah couldn't sleep, and even Daniel, normally so calm, seemed restless. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he felt something was wrong. "Why does he want to take us?" he asked, holding Sarah's hand as he lay on the bed. She fought to hold back the tears. "Because he thinks we're his," he replied, his voice weak. "But we are not. We will never be again." With Ikaro's departure, the shelter entered a period of uncertainty. Sarah knew that her father had not given up, and that the security they thought they had there could collapse at any moment. She spent hours talking to Donna Alice and the caregivers, trying to understand what the next steps would be. There was a possibility of seeking legal help, of trying to ensure that Icarus was kept away from them, but Sarah knew that would not be simple. Icarus was manipulative and dangerous, and even if the authorities got involved, he could find a way to game the system. The caregivers suggested something that made Sarah's stomach turn. They might need to be transferred to another shelter, in an even more distant location. The idea of starting all over again, of leaving behind the place where they had finally found some peace, was devastating. Daniel was flourishing there. He had made friends, bonded, and for the first time since they ran away from home, he seemed truly happy. Sarah didn't want to tear him away from that environment, but she knew his safety was her priority. Over the next few weeks, as negotiations with local authorities took place, Sarah found herself trapped in a cycle of fear and anxiety. Every time he heard a car approaching, his body tensed. She could no longer go out without feeling watched, and although she tried to maintain a calm appearance for Daniel's sake, inside she was falling apart. Every talk of change brought more weight to her shoulders, and she wondered if she would ever be able to escape Icarus' shadow. Daniel, in turn, remained oblivious to most of the discussions. He felt something was wrong, of course, but he didn't have the same understanding of the danger that surrounded them. His days were filled with drawing, playing, and laughing with other children. Sometimes Sarah felt envious of the way he was able to move forward, even in the midst of so much chaos. She desperately wished she could go back to being the carefree girl she was before everything fell apart. But that girl no longer existed. Then one day, while everyone was gathered for dinner, one of the caregivers received a call. The silence that followed was heavy. Donna Alice approached Sarah and, with a serious look, announced the decision that everyone feared. "You need to get out of here," she said, the words filled with sadness. "The shelter is no longer safe. Icarus is closer than we thought." The news hit Sarah like a blow. They would need to abandon the shelter, the only place she and Daniel had known as home since their escape. That night, while everyone slept, Sarah sat next to Daniel, watching him in silence. His heart was heavy, full of uncertainty. The decision had already been made, and within a few days, they would be transferred to another shelter, this time in an even more distant city. There was little choice. Icarus was very close, and his presence hovered like an ever-threatening shadow. The next day, Donna Alice called Sarah for a private conversation. "I know this isn't what you expected," she said, her voice soft but full of seriousness. "But we need to make sure you and Daniel stay safe. Icarus won't give up easily, and if he finds an opening, he'll use it." Sarah knew that Donna Alice was right. Icarus's every move seemed calculated, like that of a patient hunter, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't just fear that motivated her, but also the instinct to protect Daniel. She would give her life for her brother, and that included making sacrifices that didn't always seem fair. The logistics of the move were carefully organized. The new shelter was several hours away, in a small country town, far from any major roads. It was a place that rarely received attention, and the idea was precisely that, to disappear. Sarah and Daniel left in silence, accompanied by one of the caregivers and Donna Alice. The farewell to the other children was discreet, but full of sad looks. The friendships they had formed would be left behind, and Sarah knew Daniel would suffer as a result. He didn't understand why they needed to leave again. "Why are we always running away?" he asked, his eyes confused and sad. Sarah tried to explain, but her words seemed empty, even to herself. In the car, as the landscapes flashed by outside the window, Sarah fought the feeling of helplessness that was growing inside her. She was tired of running away. Each change seemed to take them further from any kind of stability, as if they were on an endless journey, always escaping the monster that pursued them. Daniel, sitting next to her, held Sarah's hand, without saying a word. He had always trusted his sister, but now even he was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. His innocence wouldn't protect him forever, and Sarah feared the moment when he would fully realize the gravity of what they were facing. The new shelter, when they finally arrived, was even simpler than the previous one. The exposed brick walls and small rooms gave a cold feeling that Sarah couldn't ignore. Donna Alice tried to comfort them, assuring them that this would be a new beginning, but the reality was difficult to face. They were increasingly distant, isolated from the world and from the few people with whom they had created bonds. It was as if they were condemned to a life of constant transience. For Sarah, the sense of loss was profound, but she could not allow it to show. Daniel needed her, and that was what kept her going. In the first few weeks, adaptation was slow. Daniel missed his friends and the activities he loved so much at the old shelter. He often asked when they could return, but Sarah, not knowing what to say, always said nothing. The atmosphere in the new place was different, more rigid, and although they were treated well, fear never stopped lurking. The threat of Icarus still hung over them, like a nightmare that refused to end. And, even far away, Sarah felt that time was running out. Icarus wouldn't find them there for now, but how long could they keep running? Time passed slowly in the new shelter, but the fear never left them. Sarah lived with the constant feeling that something was about to happen, as if destiny was just waiting for the right moment to throw them back into the path of Icarus. She tried to occupy her mind, helping with the shelter's tasks and participating in activities with the other children, but the tension was palpable. Daniel, in turn, was still trying to adapt. His sadness manifested itself in small details. His lack of enthusiasm for drawing, the way he isolated himself from others. He felt the absence of everything they knew, and Sarah suffered from not being able to give him answers or guarantees that things would get better. One afternoon, while packing her belongings in the small room she shared with Daniel, Sarah heard a conversation outside the door. Two caregivers spoke in whispers, but she managed to capture the gist. Icarus was active again. He had been seen asking for them in another nearby town, apparently following false leads, but the proximity was frightening. Sarah stopped, feeling her blood run cold in her veins. Even there, in such a remote place, he hunted them. His obsession with regaining control over them was relentless. Sarah decided to talk to Donna Alice about this. I felt that, more than ever, they needed a definitive solution. "We can't go on like this," she said, her voice low but firm. "We can't keep running forever." Donna Alice looked at her with understanding. She knew Sarah was right, but she also knew her options were limited. "You're right, Sarah," she said with a sigh. "But we need to think calmly. Taking drastic measures could put you in more danger." Sarah's anguish increased every day. She knew that Icarus was closer than ever, even if he hadn't yet found shelter. The fact that he was active again, searching for them with such determination, was an omen that something big was about to happen. She lived in constant fear that, at any moment, he could appear and destroy everything they had fought for. During a meeting with the caregivers, Donna Alice mentioned the possibility of an emergency plan, a plan that would mean an even more radical move, perhaps out of the country. However, the bureaucracy involved in such a move was immense. Child protection laws varied from region to region, and without the support of a strong lawyer, the chances of success were slim. Furthermore, there was the emotional factor. How would Daniel deal with yet another change? He was already fragile, and the idea of taking him away from everything again seemed cruel. But the fear of Icarus catching up to them was even more terrifying. Sarah felt trapped in a maze with no way out, where every decision seemed to take them further away from freedom. Then, one rainy night, the inevitable happened. The sound of tires on gravel outside the shelter brought back all of Sarah's worst nightmares. She ran to the window and saw, through the curtain of rain, an old car, much like Icarus's, parking there. Her heart raced, and before she could think, she grabbed Daniel's hand. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. But Daniel, tired and confused, didn't understand what was happening. Sarah and Daniel hurried out a side door, trying to avoid the imminent confrontation. The rain was falling heavily, wetting his clothes and making it difficult to see. The shelter was on alert, but the caregivers hadn't had time to fully react to the car's sudden arrival. With her hand firmly in Daniel's, Sarah ran through the darkness, the sound of raindrops drowning out her own footsteps. Her thoughts were confused, panic controlled her, and all she could think about was running away. Icarus was there. He had finally found them, and now everything was about to fall apart. However, as she turned the corner of the shelter, Sarah stopped abruptly. There, under the dim light of a streetlight, was Icarus. But something was different. He didn't move with the aggression she remembered, and his face, instead of being full of anger, carried an expression of deep weariness, almost despair. For a moment, Sarah froze, unable to process what she was seeing. He didn't look like the man who had terrorized her childhood. He was thinner, older, with his shoulders hunched as if the weight of years of bad decisions had finally caught up with him. "I just want to talk to you," Icarus said, his voice hoarse and weakened by time and fatigue. Sarah pulled Daniel closer, her heart beating violently. "Speak?" she repeated in disbelief. Everything inside her screamed to run away, but curiosity and confusion kept her still. The man before her didn't look like the same monster they had left behind. Something had changed, but the fear Sarah felt was still overwhelming. Icarus took a step forward, but he was careful, as if he didn't want to scare them even more. "I know I was wrong, that I caused a lot of suffering," he began, his voice shaking, "but things have changed. I'm changed." The rain fell around them, mixing with the tears that Sarah didn't even realize were running down her face. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could I believe? After everything he put them through, how could he forgive or trust? "We were never really yours," Sarah replied, her voice breaking. "You have no right to be here." But there was something in Icarus's eyes, a genuine sadness, that made Sarah hesitate. Daniel, who until then had been silent and confused, looked at his father with his big innocent eyes and, surprisingly, took a step forward. "Father?" he asked, his voice small and full of curiosity. Sarah tried to hold him back, but Daniel escaped her hands, heading towards the man who, for so long, was the symbol of all the fear they experienced. Icarus knelt in front of Daniel, silent tears streaming down his aged face. "I am not that man anymore," Icarus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I just wanted a chance to show it." That moment froze time for Sarah. All the pain, the fear, the hatred that she had accumulated for years seemed to explode inside her. She didn't know if she could believe him, but she also didn't know if she could continue living with so much weight on her shoulders. There, in the rain, Sarah finally understood that, although she could never forget what happened, perhaps it was time to stop running from the past.